Deep beneath the granite floors of the Springfield Monument lies a secret that most visitors walk right over without ever realizing. We are told that our leaders rest in peace, but for Abraham Lincoln, the journey to his final rest was a nightmare of grave robbers, secret societies, and a desperate race to protect a corpse. Imagine it's the year 1876. America is at a crossroads. The wounds of the Civil War are still fresh, and the nation is distracted by one of the most chaotic presidential elections in history. While the public is focused on the ballot box, a group of men in a smoky Chicago basement is focused on a different kind of prize. This wasn't a group of political radicals or Southern sympathizers. They were professional counterfeiters, and they were about to attempt the most audacious heist in American history. The man behind the plan was James Big Jim Canally. He was the boss of a massive counterfeiting ring, but he had a problem. His master engraver, Ben Boyd, the man who made their fake bills look like the real thing, had been captured and sent to prison. Without Boyd, the money stopped flowing. Big Jim needed a bargaining chip, something so valuable the government would be forced to trade his engraver for it. He decided that the bargaining chip would be the body of Abraham Lincoln. The plan was as cold as it was simple. They would break into the Lincoln tomb, steal the coffin, and race across the state line to the Indiana sand dunes. There, they would bury the president in the sand and send a ransom note to the governor of Illinois. The price for the body? $200,000 in cash and a full pardon for their master engraver. Big Jim recruited two small-time thugs for the job, Terrence Mullen and Jack Hughes. But these men were career criminals, not tomb raiders. They needed an expert, someone who knew the layout of the cemetery. They reached out to a man named Louis Swegels. What they didn't know was that Swegels was a roper, a paid informant for the newly formed United States Secret Service. On the night of November 7, 1876, the air in Springfield was thick with tension. As the polls closed across the country, the three men crept toward Oak Ridge Cemetery. The Lincoln Monument loomed out of the darkness, a massive spire of stone. At the time, it was shockingly vulnerable. There were no armed guards, no security lights, and no cameras. Just a single padlock on a heavy door. Inside the tomb, the atmosphere changed. It was silent and smelled of cold stone and damp earth. Using a simple hacksaw, Mullen and Hughes began to cut through the padlock. The sound of metal grinding against metal echoed through the marble halls. It took them 30 minutes of grueling work to break the lock and enter the memorial hall. Once inside, they found the grand sarcophagus. It was a massive marble chest that housed the president's remains. They weren't prepared for the weight. They used a crowbar to pry the lid off, the heavy stone screeching as it slid aside. Inside sat a cedar coffin, lead-lined and weighing over 500 pounds. They struggled, sweating in the dark, managed to move the coffin only a few inches. Mullen turned to Swegels, the informant, and told him to go get the wagon. This was the moment the trap was supposed to spring. Swegels walked out into the night and gave the signal to the Secret Service agents hiding in the shadows of the cemetery. What followed was a comedy of errors that nearly turned deadly. The agents, led by a man named Patrick Terrell, rushed the tomb with their pistols drawn. But in the 19th century, there were no tactical lights or radios. One agent's boot slipped on the stone. Another agent, startled by the noise, accidentally fired his pistol. The gunshot boomed inside the tomb like a cannon. The Secret Service agents, blinded by the smoke of their own gunpowder and the pitch-black night, began shooting at each other, thinking the grave robbers were firing back. In the absolute chaos and confusion, Mullen and Hughes slipped out of a side door and vanished into the darkness. They fled back to Chicago, thinking they had escaped. They were wrong. Because their trusted partner was an informant, the authorities knew exactly where they were going. 10 days later, the Secret Service walked into a Chicago tavern called The Hub and arrested them while they were bragging about their narrow escape. But the story doesn't end with their arrest. In fact, that's when it gets even stranger. At that time, Illinois had no law on the books against stealing a corpse. Grave robbing was considered a victimless crime because the dead couldn't own property. The only thing the government could charge them with was conspiracy to steal a casket, which carried a maximum sentence of only 1 year in prison. The public was horrified. The thought that the great emancipator could be stolen for the price of a cheap box shook the nation. The custodian of the tomb, John Carroll Power, was so traumatized by the event that he became obsessed with protecting the body. He didn't trust the locks anymore. He didn't trust the marble. In the middle of the night, Power and a small group of trusted men secretly removed Lincoln's body from the sarcophagus. They took it to the basement of the monument and buried it in a shallow, unmarked grave. They covered the spot with scrap wood and leftover construction debris. For years, the millions of people who came to pay their respects to the president were actually bowing before an empty marble box. The real Abraham Lincoln was lying in the dirt under a pile of trash in the cellar, hidden from the world for his own safety. It wasn't until 1901 that the president finally found peace. His eldest son, Robert Todd Lincoln, visited the tomb and was disgusted by how his father's remains had been treated. He ordered a final, permanent solution. Workers dug a hole 10 feet deep into the floor of the tomb. They placed the coffin inside a thick cage made of reinforced steel. And then they poured. Tons of liquid blue-gray concrete were poured over the cage, filling the vault to the brim. They waited for it to dry into a solid, impenetrable block of stone. Today, if you visit Springfield, you are standing above that massive block of concrete. It took a crew of desperate counterfeiters and a failed heist to prove that the only way to keep the president safe was to bury him in a fortress that no man could ever open again. Abraham Lincoln had survived a civil war. He had survived an assassin's bullet, but his final battle was fought in the dark of a cemetery against the greed of men. Now, encased in stone and steel, he finally rests in the peace he earned for his country.